All right, hello class. Welcome to this part of the Kin 319 lecture. What we're going to talk about here is the training load to start out with, and then we'll talk about a few other sections. But it shouldn't take too long of a video, but it'll be important for you to have a little bit of a background so you're ready for Monday, the case study. So when we're talking about training load, it's the amount of weight to be used during a resistance training session. So think of it as the amount of weight that you're going to lift. So load will closely be associated with the number of reps that can be completed. And the number of reps done will determine the type of adaptation. Well, one way to determine what load a person needs to do is doing a 1 repetition maximum. And a 1 rep max, or 1 RM, is the amount of weight that someone can lift one time. And it's considered the gold standard for strength assessment. Examples that people would use is the bench press, squat, power clean. And the key though, when you're doing 1 RM, make sure the person needs to make they're doing proper form. It's not how much weight you lift, but how much weight you lift properly that's going to matter. There are some limitations to this. Training status, may not be as effective on a novice as it might be for someone who might be more advanced. But you can still use it on novice. You just need to make sure they have a familiarization phase that we talked about in lesson 4, how that can affect 1 RM assessment. And then the mode, you have to decide if it's going to be free weights versus machines. Typically that's going to be decided based on upon what you envision the person's going to be using more of in their exercises. Are they going to be using more free weights? Then they probably should have a 1 RM done on free weights. Or if it's going to be using more machines, then probably the 1 RM would be best to be assessed on a machine. When you're assessing a load, you can do a direct assessment or you can do an estimate. A direct assessment is where you actually get into and you actually directly assess the individual's amount that they can lift. The key here is that 1 RM is going to require adequate training status, so intermediate or advanced, and experience with exercise being tested. Now that doesn't mean that the person who's novice can't do a 1 RM. You just need to take more care and ensure that the person knows how to do it, is familiar with it to avoid injury. You can choose core exercises for a 1 RM testing, so usually large muscle groups, multi-joint exercises. Choose exercise that can accurately and consistently assess muscular strength and then allow the individual to maintain correct body position throughout the testing. So again, you want to make sure that you're doing something, you're assessing a 1 RM in which an exercise that they will actually be doing during their exercise prescription. Again, beginners can do a 1 RM if the RT professional provides a familiar period. Now, if you feel that the person it may not be best to do a 1 RM, they may have some kind of limitation that might prevent them from doing a 1 RM, safety might be a concern, or you can actually do an estimate of 1 RM using a 1 RM table or prediction equation, which we'll get to in a little bit. Here's a direct assessment of 1 RM and how to do it. You don't need to memorize every single detail, but just generally the idea is what you'll need to be familiar with. And so you start off with instructing the athlete to warm up with some light resistance, allow 5 to 10 reps, provide some rest period, and then you're going to start to progressively add more weight to that exercise. As you can see, if it's going to be a lower body exercise, or excuse me, upper body exercise, you increase by 10 to 20 pounds, and then lower body 30 to 40 pounds. Again, have them do 3 to 5 reps. Then they rest again. Then they repeat, you add some more weight, do 3 to 5, a couple of reps. Then you provide some more rest period. And then you make a load increase. And then again, one more time, you allow them to do a few repetitions, rest a little bit. And then you finally would, at this point, assess. You try to estimate based on their warm-up and working with them about what their 1 RM would be. So you put their weight on. So for example, if someone was doing a bench press, you might start off and you might have them do 30 pounds. And then they do 5 to 10 reps, rest a minute. You might add 20 pounds. So now they do 50 pounds, rest, do 70 pounds, rest, and then they may be ready for their 1 RM attempt, which might be 100 pounds. If the athlete is able to do that 1 RM, then what you want to do is have them rest, and then you would incrementally start to increase the amount of weight you would add to that weight. So it might be 5 to 10 pounds. You have them perform it. If they're able to do it, you have them repeat it again after resting 2 to 4 minutes. If unfortunately they're not able to do the 1RM, then you have to decrease the weight and have them attempt a 1RM to get the weight that they're at. But the idea is that you really want to start out light, let them progressively increase the amount of weight, maybe 3 or 4 different times that you would do this, and then you have them attempt a 1RM. So you want to make sure, as we talked about in lesson 4, it's very critical that the individual that you assess their 1RM properly, so you can then determine their exercise prescription based on that 1RM. And generally speaking, when you do a 1RM, usually people will do a 1RM for at least one for their lower body and one for their upper body. So it just depends. They may do multiple ones. Again, large groups you could do, again, you might do 1RM for the chest, the back, and then maybe the quadriceps. And that would kind of get, again, an idea of overall strength increases. Now, the other one is if it's not advisable to do a 1RM directly, then you can use a 1RM table. And you can find this in your book on page 360 to 362. And you can use this to estimate a person's 1RM from it. And let me explain, you're going to see in a moment, you're going to see in the max reps equals 10. That means percent 1RM equals 75 column. So let me explain in the next column or next table of how this works. So this is just part of this table 15.6. Please note that it goes on for quite some time, but this is just a snapshot of part of it. So please note that at the bottom here, it continues on much farther down to give you higher weights. But to give you an idea, let's say, for example, you decide that you want someone to do 8 repetitions, and that person does 8 repetitions of a bench press, and they're able to do it, let's say 40 pounds, or excuse me, that amount of weight that they put on was 40 pounds. So maybe back up, let's say they do 40 pounds, they were able to do it 8 times, then you predict that their 1RM would be 50. Or another example would be, let's say, for example, you wanted them to do 5 repetitions. You indicate that, hey, okay, let's have them do 70 pounds, and they were able to do that 5 times, then they would indicate that their estimated 1RM was 80 pounds. So that's just an example. So let's say, for example, they were able to do 60 pounds, and they did that 10 times, then their estimated 1RM was 80. So this is a way to, as an estimate, that you can prevent potential injury or it might not be advisable based on the individual's health risk. Now you can do prediction equations. Something to keep in mind, prediction equations are most accurate when based on low multiple RM testing. So for example, the 3 RM test will provide a better estimate than a 12 RM test because you're closer to the 1 RM, the 1 repetition. These aren't too commonly used, but it's just something that's in your book and just to be advisable. But here are some equations that you can use to estimate their 1 RM. Please keep in mind again that these are equations, so they're estimates. They're not going to be as accurate as doing the direct assessment, but they are available if you so choose. One thing to keep in mind is that you should do the 1 RM periodically, maybe every few months would be advisable to help with adjusting the person's exercise prescription. Maybe every 2 months you want to test their 1 RM to make any adjustments that might be needed. Or for example, they might be coming off of an in-season to off-season. That might be a good time to assess as well, or going from an off-season to a pre-season or something the case, that might be advisable. Or if you haven't seen the client or the athlete for quite some time, it might be advisable to reassess their 1 RM. Training volume. Well, training volume provides a measure of the amount of work that is being performed by exercise and total for the session. And the way you do exercise volume is it's sets times the reps times the weight lifted. So for example, if someone did a bench press, 3 sets, 10 reps each set, 100 pounds, you would do 3 times 10 times 100 pounds. So the bench press load volume for that day was 3,000 pounds. You would then do a total session volume is you would simply repeat this process for all the exercises, and then you would add all the total volumes for each exercise up, and that would be your total volume for the day. And the way this is used is effective. It gives you a big picture. It's kind of like minutes of exercise. If someone was going to do aerobic exercise, they went out and did 50 minutes of exercise. Well, this kind of gives you a quantifiable total amount of weight that they lifted. And it can be used to progress athletes by varying total volume for exercise session. So for example, you may want to be able to keep the individual at a total volume of, let's say, 50,000 pounds that they lifted, but you could then vary the amount of weight that they may do upper body versus lower body. So if you want to increase their volume for upper body, let's say, they want to do focus more on upper body, but you still want to keep the amount of total weight lifted for the exercise, well, that means you would need to decrease the amount of weight for their lower body. So those are ways that then you can use progression. So you can show a client, for example, by doing this. This is another way to show exercise prescription about the amount of weight, total weight that they lifted, the volume of weight lifted is a very effective way to show. Just like minutes of exercise, you can show that someone over time increased the amount of aerobic, brisk walking, for example. They were able to increase from 30 minutes a day to now 50 minutes a day. Well, the same thing here. You can show that as a bench press, you went from lifting 3,000 pounds per day to now lifting 4,000 pounds. And your total amount that you lifted in an exercise session went from 50,000 pounds to, let's say, 70,000 pounds. So it's kind of a good total body workout. And training volume is really important, especially if you're doing off season or if your goal is to try to build mass, large, hypertrophy. Higher amounts of volume are going to be necessary to stimulate that muscle for muscle growth. So keep that in mind, that volume is something that gives you a good big picture view of what a person might be doing with resistance training. Well, how can you determine volume and training load? Well, here's an example of some tables from your book. And this is the training emphasis, the goal that the person might have. And here's the load, the percent of the person's 1RM. And if the person is novice, for example, and their goal is muscular endurance, then you want to keep it between or less than 65% of 1RM. Well, that would translate to repetitions between 10 and 15. You would need to decide, is it 10, is it 12, is it 15? But let's say the person might be intermediate and their goal is hypertrophy. So they might be somewhere between 67 and 85% of 1RM. Let's say you may start them off at 70%, and the repetitions would vary around 6 to 12. Now for the training volume, how would that mean? So you have the same idea in terms of repetitions. So you basically are taking this part of this table and moving it down here. And then what would that translate to the number of sets? Well, again, using that muscular endurance example, person who is doing that 65% of 1RM translates to 10 to 15 repetitions, and they would do anywhere from 1 to 3 sets. They may start out in the first 1 or 2 weeks doing 1 set, then progress to 2 sets, and then 3 sets. So it's just something that you would have to use with your exercise prescription, but this is just something how you'd be able to use that 1RM. Now you can see, as we've talked about, assessing that 1RM is critical, because if you end up having a 1RM that might be too low and not assessed properly, then all of your exercise prescription, your number of repetitions and your number of sets might be lower than what it should be, and therefore might delay or prevent the continued progression in their as they continue to do resistance training. So it's going to be critical that you assess their 1RM properly, and that then you determine what the reps and sets will be. Finally, this is rest periods, and this is something I mentioned in class, that rest periods is one of the most overlooked and improperly used part of resistance training. And it simply is the time period between sets. And the heavier the load, the longer the rest, generally speaking. Influenced by training status, beginners or untrained clients will require more rest than an advanced client. And when teaching new lifts, always allow for plenty of time for recovery to make sure that they get the form down first before you start increasing the amount of weight. Now here's an example of the different rest periods based on the goal. So rest interval for muscular endurance is 30 seconds or less. Hypertrophy is 30 seconds to a minute and a half. And muscular power is anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes, and same with strength. Now the key here is, when I've been emphasizing rest periods, is that you need to make sure that you you match whatever goal is to the rest period. For example, very commonly what people will do is they want to get hypertrophy, they want to get larger muscles. Well, here it indicates that your rest period should be no more than 90 seconds, a minute and a half. What most people end up doing, unfortunately, though, is they will sit at one machine or they will wait much longer. They may be waiting 3, 4, or 5 minutes in between. Well, you can see that now they're working more on muscular strength than they are on muscular hypertrophy. Because hypertrophy, you want to start the next set before you're completely recovered. Whereas strength, you want to make sure you're almost completely recovered before you're going to be lifting that amount of weight. So it's going to be critical that rest periods are assigned properly in order to get the most effectiveness out of the resistance training protocol. All right, so again, we mentioned in class that you want to do the case studies 1 through 7. Here's number 5, 6, and 7. So on the case study of Sue, make sure that you have that completed for Monday. Also, as I mentioned before, you need to have a week from Friday. You're going to have a resistance training protocol that you'll be doing for someone that you know. So again, doing a resistance training protocol on someone, a friend or a family member, and that'll be due a week from Friday. I believe that is the 21st, so it'll be due January the 21st. Excuse me, February the 21st. And as a reminder, I've kind of put these as a reminder of what you need to be doing in that resistance training protocol. And we should finish up most of this, the final 8, 9, and 10 on Monday. But just make sure, again, this doesn't need to be typed. You can do it on a piece of paper, but it does need to be thorough, and it's good. It's a good practice. Students who've done in the past have found it to be effective. All right, so that is the overview of the 5, 6, and 7. Make sure you have that ready to go, and we will then move on to 8, 9, and 10 on Monday after we reviewed the case study of Sue.